As we enter the third year since COVID-19 came into existence, the virus has proven to have a lasting impact on the future of work, which, by the way, is one of the most popular terms searched on Google. In 2023, globally, organizations face historic challenges such as a competitive talent landscape, an exhausted workforce, and pressure to control cost. But are those challenges the same for African businesses? Many technological breakthroughs are rapidly shifting the frontier between activities performed by humans and the ones performed by machines, transforming the world of work. Technological progress provides a golden opportunity for emerging and developing economies, like many across the continent, to grow faster and attain higher levels of prosperity in a shorter span of time. However, there are fears that technologies could potentially displace human labor, widen income inequality, and further increase the share of informal or contingent work. That's why this week's episode of the Career Hub, powered by the African Talent Company, is looking at the trends that will shape Africa's labor market landscape in 2023. Joining me is the CEO of the African Talent Company herself, Hilda Kragha, and she'll be taking us through what the trends are and what we need to know. Hilda, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's so great to be back. Happy New Year.
The same to you. So we know that the future of work is this terminology we've been sharing. The last conversation we had was that, but now it's become the now of work. And a lot of people are sort of asking what really has changed from it being a future conversation to a conversation that really needs to be dominated right now in 2023.
Yeah, I think a number of things, right? And this all stems back to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? One, we were forced to accelerate the shift towards remote and flexible work. Many companies pre the lockdowns and pre the pandemic were still stuck in their old ways. They expected face-to-face time. They were not as digital, especially in Africa. But in a world where there's no movement, we had to accelerate that shift. So it happened a lot faster than expected. Second, because of that, we also had companies had to evaluate their policies. It highlights the need to think through, how do I make work more convenient for my employees? How do I make this work in a world where I don't see my employees? So we had to evaluate their policies, improve their practices, and pretty much get geared up to support a remote workforce, right? Because this was happening at a global scale, one, of course, naturally, automation increased. There was growth of artificial intelligence we just talked about. But more importantly, the workforce became a lot more global. So you find that people where previously they thought, I'm applying for a job in Nigeria or a job in Kenya, all of a sudden I'm applying for a job globally. And on the flip side, I can get talent globally. And so all the concepts we thought were the future of work and a bit far out removed, because of this huge seismic event over the last 2 years that happened, have been brought a lot forward. And the future of work is now.
Is one of those.
Of course, there'll always be future trends, but for now, we are where we thought would be, a decade from now, for example. Those trends are happening now.
So we've talked about how we've seen trends abroad in terms of employment and work trends, but always wondering if those same trends are reflected across sort of the employment and the labor workforce that we have here on the continent. We spoke about the Great Resignation before and more across the West. So African employers themselves, are they also facing the challenges of a competitive talent landscape, an exhausted workforce, as well as even pressure to control costs? Are they having to face the same trends we're seeing happen in the West when it comes to employment and, of course, labor?
They are. I would say that some of the challenges are a bit more nuanced. For example, in the West, with the lockdowns, because there's already a heavy digital infrastructure, there's a good power and all these other facilities that happen. With the lockdowns happening, it was very smooth. The transition was smooth. In Africa, we find that there was limited access to digital tools, technologies. It was a lot more difficult and remains a lot more difficult for companies to implement remote and flexible work in our markets. The average worker does not have infrastructure at home to support remote work. So that puts a cost pressure on African employers. You find that if you do want to have your people at home, are you going to subsidize their generators? What happens when there's no power? What happens when there's no data? We don't have consistent electricity, and all these things come into play. Additionally, of course, there's a huge economic impact on the pandemic in African countries. This has put pressure on costs for employers. There's been a decrease in consumer spending. Also, economies have just not grown as fast. So you have all these young people, you've got companies not doing as well. There's a pressure on in terms of how many people you can employ, how many people you can keep into jobs, can you keep them at the current rates of pay, are you doing instituting pay cuts? And the competition is a lot more competitive because your best talent, the people who are the ones you really want to retain, you're now competing on a global scale. We find roles like business intelligence, for example, product managers, software developers. These people now have options. I think a lot of what African employers have seen is that the people they want to retain are actually the hardest to hang on to, because for them, the labor market is now global and they've got options that will pay them in dollars, that will pay them in pounds, and allow them to work from home. which is not something African employers can always compete with.
And so following up on that, in terms of the challenges that are specific to the African labor markets in the context of African economies, what do you think some of the top challenges will be for this labor market in 2023?
Yeah, I think we'll continue to see high youth unemployment. Most African countries have a high youth population. It's been a persistent challenge. But if you look at 2023, a lot more young people coming into the workplace. Some people who had found work during the pandemic are now going to find it tougher, like in terms of gigs that had come into play because of the rise of digital, and that trend has kind of died down a bit. Second of all, you find with lots of African startups, especially in the tech space, for example, they follow the global trends. As businesses in the West do not do well, that will naturally trickle down to Africa. Second thing, I think the lack of digital skills will continue to hold us back. More companies adopting digital tools, but there's a growing gap between the African workforce that is digitized and those that are not. So some Africans will be successful. Some young workers will be very successful. They will, skyrocket in their careers. Others will continue to be left out because they're not part of this digital economy. The third thing I'd say, there's a lot of economic uncertainty. We've heard from a lot of the global players here and the thought leaders around a recession coming in 2023. There's already challenges in the economy. But if investment continues to go down, if consumer spending continues to go down, it will be harder for companies to grow and to create jobs. So that's something that I see will be a challenge. And then finally, we still have a problem of limited formal education. A lot of jobs in Africa are informal, but as we want to participate in a global workforce, we need a lot more rigorous formal education, a lot more upskilling, and basically preparing people for the work that's available, the work today and the work of tomorrow as well.
The work of today and the work of tomorrow. So let's talk a bit about tomorrow, which seems to now become today. In terms of technology, the adoption of artificial intelligence is expected to surge in 2023. According to experts, AI could also boost Africa's economy by $1.5 trillion by 2030. But how will this impact Africa's labor market landscape? You've talked about the large part of this landscape being quite informal, and many are wondering if Africa is really ready for sort of the penetration and the interruption that AI will bring into employment and labor. What do you think?
So I think on one hand, and you're very right, it's going to create jobs and new opportunities, right? Think about areas like data analysis, software development, machine learning. There's going to be very many winners, even on the African continent. And today we find there's companies whose entire business model is actually built around AI, right? And they're being successful in their small way. You don't have to be the most tech-savvy person to be part of the AI space. But as AI helps to grow efficiency and productivity in various industries, there'll be growth, right? On the other hand, and I love that you highlighted that, widespread adoption could lead to job displacement and unemployment. There's areas like manufacturing, transportation, customer service, and even things like agriculture. As you mentioned, the bulk of our labor market is still quite informal. They're in these low-level roles, which are the easiest to automate and the easiest for AI to disrupt. So countries and cities, and we need to start thinking about what happens when all these people in working, physical labor in factories, for example, are displaced. Where they're going to live when they don't live on the farms anymore. There's going to be a lot of job displacement, and the way to combat that now is think about how you retool people and reskill them such that they can participate in the opportunities that are available at the time, right? But the thing is also there'll be a difference between regions in terms of AI readiness, difference between industries, but altogether right now I would say Africa's labor market is still AI is coming, but I don't think it's going to come at us as fast as it's going to come towards the West. I think we still have some more time to prepare for it. And two, if you really position yourself, you can be one of the winners who participates in this great economy. If you're unfortunate that one of your job is going to be subsumed, then the best thing you can think about right now is how you upskill yourself and how you retool yourself for the available jobs that you can do when that time comes.
For the available jobs. And that will probably be my last question in terms of people positioning themselves to take advantage. But before that, Hilda, let's get to the Great Resignation. And that was not the only term that eventually came out of the pandemic. There were also trends like quiet quitting and quiet firing that are now very much dominating the conversation. So in terms of these terms, many people are not quite familiar with them. What are they and how do they fit in to the labor market? How will they themselves, these sort of trends and these behaviors affect the African market, the African labor market landscape in 2023?
Yeah. So just starting from what they mean, right? So the Great Resignation, I think, refers to a large number of workers that decided to leave their jobs, either to retire early or pursue other opportunities. 2 years out of the workforce or 2 years of reflection, do I still want to do this? There's been a combination of factors that drove that. And there's just this desire for flexibility and autonomy. We see that a lot of people have retired early. For those who are closer to age of retirement, so rather than wait for 60, retiring at 50, we see lots of young people who want more autonomy, leaving their full-time jobs to become contractors, to get into the gig workplace, sign up onto platforms like Upwork where they can have multiple jobs. I think it's going to continue to affect the African market, especially where it hurts the most. The most valued skills, the people who now understand that globally they're the highest demand, will continue to leave their full-time jobs for more autonomy, and it will be hard to replace them unless we have mass upskilling, which I keep referring to. On the quiet quitting side, I've always laughed at quiet quitting and quiet firing, because if you ask me, these things always existed, they just didn't have a name. The idea that you come to work and either maybe one day you just don't show up, or even worse, you just come and you do the bare minimum and leave right on time. We've always had these workers. But I think there's this trend of a feeling of dissatisfaction or frustration, either with your working conditions, lack of job security, lack of career advancement, that just are leading young people more and more often be like, you know what, I don't want to do this, but I'm just going to wait it out and do the bare minimum and just keep on treading the water. We've always had these people, this is going to increase. I think that as companies define stronger strategies to retain their workers, to define career paths, to support career advancement, it might be reversed, because a lot of this comes from frustration with the job itself. So I think employers do have some control over quiet quitting. Quiet firing, if you ask me, is actually a terrible practice, because here what happens is, the employer wants you to leave, but rather than go through a severance process and do the right thing, they frustrate you out. And again, this is something that's always happened. We've seen it, for decades. It just has a new name now. But again, there's a need to control costs, or maybe you need different skills, or even just like this generational gap. You're trying to, ease out the baby boomers and some of the Gen X people and make room for the millennials and the Gen Z. And if you're trying to cut costs, if you're trying to reinvigorate your workforce, you see a lot of quiet firing. I personally think it's a bit unethical. I think that if you want to have a conversation about your employees leaving the workforce, you should just have the right conversation and do the right things, offer them a severance package, and let them go. Quiet firing, if you ask me, is not going to survive very long, because there are labor laws in place, and eventually, employers will be a lot more in tune to their rights. You could get into trouble if this is something you're doing over and over again as a precedent, that you consistently force people out of your organization as opposed to offering them the right process of an exit.
And in terms of these sort of coming up after the pandemic, and as you said, quiet quitting and quiet firing have been in place really before the pandemic. In terms of them just being terms we're really getting much more familiar with, how deep of an impact do you think they'll have? Quiet firing, you say, is one that you think will eventually phase out because of more knowledge. And of course, it's going to be a tighter space. You're going to need to hold on to people regardless of how you feel or how managers are behaving. In the long run, really, are we all going to be able to live and move beyond this? How much impact do you think they'll have on the labor market?
So I think the biggest impact of this create an uncertain and unstable work environment, right? So you find in a company where there's lots of quiet quitting or quiet firing happening, the productivity is generally low. If your best people are quiet quitting on you, of course, then you get into the whole process of hiring, of ramping up staff again. There's a lot of productivity lost in that place. I think what's going to happen is eventually we will be forced to get to a place where people understand that succession planning is probably the best tool you can build to have resilience against such things. Where companies take training a lot more seriously, take structured career paths a lot more seriously, where you've kind of got a pipeline of talent as opposed to focusing on poaching when you need somebody. You're building internally your own pipeline of talent, where, should somebody leave suddenly, I do have somebody that can backfill for that role. And that's actually a good thing for the ecosystem overall. I think the more people are trained into management roles or into mid-level roles, whatever it is, the more you can backfill, you can invest in early stage talent and they grow with you into management position in the organization, the better off the ecosystem is overall, because right now what's happening is the few people who have the right skills keep bouncing around from one company to the other, mostly off monetary benefits, but are not increasing the depth of the talent bench overall.
And that makes a lot of sense. It's also a note for concern. So Hilda, before I let you go, how do employers, employees, and even job seekers themselves position themselves to take advantage of the trends that we believe will dominate the African labor market landscape in 2023?
I think for everybody, whether an employer or an employee or job seeker, digital, you have to brush up on your digital skills. You have to invest deeply in things you thought you could never do, skills on the digital front that you thought maybe would never apply to you. For employers, making sure that you've got a very high rate of digital literacy, of data literacy in your organization. That's going to be very, very important. For employees as well, it's going to be increasingly hard to get a good value, sustainable job if you're not part of the digital economy. And for a job seeker, of course, it just opens up opportunities, beyond your local market to other things. I think for employers, you're going to have to focus on training and development opportunities. If people are frustrated with their jobs, you have to make it cool for them to want to come to work again. Thinking through employee value proposition. Why is somebody staying here with me? A lot of the last 2 years has taken away job security for people. So I think employers have to spend a lot of time promoting job security and career advancement, and supporting employees might be affected by job displacement. I think sometimes it's inevitable. You have to do layoffs, you have to do salary cuts, but how you approach this proposition with empathy and understanding these are human people, these are human beings with a life, with families, and making sure you can help them through this transition smoothly is going to be important. For employees, as always, keep developing yourselves. Make sure you are being visible in your organization. Take on projects that are passionate to you. Think of not just your job, but more of a career portfolio. Understanding that you have to keep on developing your skills such that should you lose your job suddenly, or should you have another interest, you can quickly pivot into that without the need to ask yourself, what next, right? So the idea of a career portfolio, I think, becomes more important for the seeker, the job seeker, and the employer, where it's not just one thing that you can do, but several things that you're doing at the same time, be it as hobbies, be it as side hustles, but they kind of combine together to help you earn a sustainable living and help you identify yourself in your space as an expert with or without your job.
All right, Hilda Kragha, thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to see you again, the CEO of the African Talent Company, right here on the Career Hub, powered by the African Talent Company. And conversations around labor markets, employment, and employees will continue throughout the year with them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.
All right.
Bye.
And before we wrap things up, just take a look at this.